When a police officer spotted a little girl running frantically through the busy London streets and later found her trembling in an old phone booth, he knew something was terribly wrong. But the moment he saw who was on the other end of that phone line, he panicked and immediately called for backup. Why was this frightened child alone in a phone booth, and who was she calling so desperately? Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from today, and if you like these stories, don't forget to subscribe. The clock on St. James's Church struck 7 as PC Daniel Harris began his morning patrol along Pall Mall. The early autumn sun had already risen, casting a warm glow over the historic street. At 35, Daniel was a seasoned officer, his keen eyes scanning the gradually awakening thoroughfare, alert for any sign of trouble in this bustling heart of London. The street was coming to life, the quiet of dawn giving way to the familiar rhythm of a city stirring. Shopkeepers raised their shutters with metallic clatters, while early commuters hurried past, many clutching takeaway coffee cups from the cafes that had just opened their doors. The air was filled with a mix of aromas, freshly baked croissants, rich coffee, and the lingering scent of last night's rain on the pavement. Daniel inhaled deeply, savoring these familiar scents. He'd been patrolling this beat for the better part of a decade, and he knew every nook and cranny of these streets. From the antiquarian bookshops with their musty tomes to the glittering jewelry stores now unveiling their displays behind thick glass. As the minutes ticked by, the street grew busier. Office workers in smart suits strode purposefully towards their buildings, while a small group of tourists gathered around their guide, cameras at the ready despite the early hour. Daniel checked his watch, 7:15 a.m. His shift had started just over an hour ago, and so far it had been routine. But he knew from experience that even the most ordinary mornings could take unexpected turns. As if on cue, a flash of blue caught Daniel's eye. A small figure darted past him, moving so quickly it was almost a blur. It took him a moment to process what he'd seen. A little black girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, wearing a blue dress that fluttered behind her as she ran. "Be careful," Daniel called out instinctively, his voice barely carrying over the growing street noise. The girl didn't slow down or even glance back, her small feet pattering against the pavement as she weaved through the increasing crowd with surprising agility. For a moment, Daniel hesitated. It wasn't unusual to see children out at this hour, heading to school or perhaps an early morning activity. But something about this girl's determined pace and the fact that she was alone set off alarm bells in his mind. Most children her age would be accompanied by an adult, especially in this busy part of the city. He scanned the area, expecting to see a harried parent or guardian chasing after the child. But as the seconds ticked by and no one appeared, a sense of unease began to grow in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't just a child running late for school or playing around. Something was wrong. Daniel began to move, his eyes fixed on the retreating figure in blue. The girl was small and quick, darting between pedestrians with ease. He found himself apologizing as he gently pushed past a man juggling a briefcase and a paper cup of coffee, and a woman engrossed in her mobile phone. "Excuse me," he murmured repeatedly, trying to keep his voice calm even as his concern grew. "Pardon me, police business." He caught another glimpse of the girl as she rounded a corner, heading towards St. James's Park. The park was already open, joggers and early morning dog walkers dotting its paths. But Daniel knew the vast green space could still be dangerous for a lone child, especially one who seemed to be running from something, or someone. As he reached the corner, Daniel broke into a jog. "Stop!" he called out, his voice now tinged with a mix of concern and frustration. The girl glanced back, her eyes widening with fear at the sight of the uniformed officer in pursuit. Instead of slowing down, she ran faster, her small legs pumping furiously as she darted across the street. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he watched the girl narrowly avoid a taxi, its horn blaring angrily as it screeched to a halt. He cursed under his breath as he was forced to stop at the red light, watching helplessly as the child disappeared into the greenery of the park. The seconds seemed to stretch into eternity as Daniel waited for the light to change. He bounced on the balls of his feet, his eyes fixed on the spot where the girl had vanished. Around him, pedestrians muttered and grumbled, annoyed at his apparent impatience. But Daniel paid them no mind. His entire focus was on the child, who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere and was now running from what or whom? When the light finally turned green, Daniel sprinted across the road, his police radio bouncing against his hip. He entered the park, the relative quiet a stark contrast to the busy street he'd just left. The morning light filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the winding paths. Early joggers pounded the gravel trails, and dog walkers strolled leisurely, their pets sniffing at every bush and tree. Daniel's eyes darted from person to person, searching for any sign of the blue dress. He caught a flash of color in the distance and set off in that direction, his boots crunching on the gravel path. Just as he thought he was gaining on her, a group of morning joggers crossed his path, momentarily blocking his view. "Excuse me," Daniel called out, trying to peer around the group. "Police officer, please make way." But by the time the joggers passed, the girl was gone. Daniel spun around, his eyes scanning the park desperately. More people were entering the park now, heading to work or starting their morning exercise routines. But there was no sign of the little girl in the blue dress. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving Daniel standing alone in the middle of the path, his chest heaving and his mind racing with questions. As the reality of the situation sank in, Daniel felt a mix of frustration and worry wash over him. Who was this child? Where had she come from? And where was she going in such a hurry? And most importantly, was she safe? With a deep breath, Daniel straightened his uniform and tried to calm his racing thoughts. He knew that panicking wouldn't help. He needed to approach this methodically, like any other case. The girl couldn't have gone far. She must still be in the park somewhere, and he was determined to find her, no matter how long it took. The morning was still young, but already it promised to be anything but ordinary. As Daniel set off down one of the park's many paths, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a very long day. Daniel made his way deeper into St. James's Park. Around him, the park was coming to life. As he walked, Daniel's mind raced with possibilities. The girl couldn't have simply vanished. He tried to piece together what little he knew. She was young, probably around 7 or 8 years old. Her blue dress had looked clean and well kept, not the attire of a street child. And she had been running with purpose, not aimlessly. He approached an elderly couple seated on a park bench overlooking the lake. The man wore a tweed jacket despite the warming day, and the woman held a small yapping terrier on her lap. "Excuse me," Daniel said, flashing his badge. "I'm PC Daniel Harris. I'm looking for a little girl who ran into the park a few minutes ago. She's wearing a blue dress. Did you happen to see her?" The woman's brow furrowed in concentration. "Oh yes, officer," she said, her voice quavering slightly with age. "I did see a child matching that description. Poor thing looked frightened. She went that way." She pointed towards a cobblestone path that led away from the main area of the park. "Thank you, ma'am," Daniel replied, his pulse quickening. "Did you notice anything else? Was anyone with her or following her?" The man shook his head. "No, she was alone, seemed to be in quite a hurry, though. Is she in some sort of trouble?" Daniel hesitated, not wanting to cause undue alarm. "I'm not sure yet. I just need to make sure she's safe. Thank you both for your help." As he set off in the direction the couple had indicated, Daniel's mind was already formulating a plan. This area of the park was less frequented, with only a few early morning joggers and dog walkers about. If the girl was trying to hide, this would be an ideal spot. He passed a small cluster of food stalls, their owners just beginning to set up for the day. The smell of frying bacon and freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, reminding Daniel that he hadn't had breakfast yet. But finding the girl was more important than satisfying his growling stomach. As he rounded a bend in the path, something caught his eye. A phone booth stood alone near the edge of the park, its red paint faded and chipped. In this age of mobile phones, these old phone booths were becoming increasingly rare, relics of a bygone era. But something about this one made Daniel pause. He approached cautiously, his police instincts on high alert. Through the grimy windows, he could see something moving inside. A flash of blue. His heart leapt. It had to be her. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing pulse. He didn't want to frighten the girl any more than she already was. As he reached for the door handle, he heard a few quick, quiet words from inside. The voice was young, female, and clearly distressed. Gently, he opened the door. "Here you are," he said, keeping his voice low and calm. "I've been looking for you. Are you all right?" The girl inside gasped, her eyes wide with fear. She quickly hung up the phone and pressed herself into the corner of the booth, as far away from Daniel as she could get in the small space. Her arms wrapped tightly around herself, and she looked up at him with a mixture of defiance and terror. Daniel crouched down to her level, careful to keep his body language open and non-threatening. He noticed that her dress, while still neat, was slightly rumpled now, and there were tear tracks on her cheeks. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'm here to help. Can you tell me your name?" The girl remained silent, fresh tears welling up in her eyes. Daniel sighed inwardly, recognizing a behavior he'd seen countless times before. Street children often pretended to cry before making a sneaky escape when an officer was distracted. But something told him this wasn't the case here. The girl's fear seemed genuine, and her clothing and overall appearance didn't match that of a typical street child. "Listen," he said, his voice low and gentle but firm. "I'm a police officer. See my badge? You can trust me. I just want to make sure you're safe. Can you tell me who you were calling?" The girl shook her head vigorously, her braids swinging with the motion. "Mom told me not to tell anyone. My name, or any personal information," she murmured, her voice scarcely above a whisper, as she swallowed her nerves between each hesitant word. Daniel nodded, understanding her caution but frustrated by it. "That's good advice usually," he said, "but I'm a police officer. You can tell me anything and I'll help you. Are you in some kind of trouble?" The girl's lower lip trembled, but she remained silent. When Daniel reached out his hand to her, she flinched away, pressing herself even further into the corner of the booth. After several more failed attempts to coax information from her, Daniel began to reassess the situation. This wasn't a simple case of a lost child or a runaway. Something more complex was at play here, and he needed to tread carefully. "Look," he said, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice, "I can't leave you here by yourself. It's not safe. You need to come with me." "Please don't catch me," the girl pleaded, her voice trembling. "I'm not the bad guy." Daniel felt his heart twist at her words. What had this child been through to make her so afraid? He took a deep breath, deciding to try a different approach. "I just want to help you," he said softly. "And to do that, I need to know more. Can you tell me where you live? Or where your mum is?" The girl hesitated, conflict clear in her eyes. Finally, in a voice so quiet Daniel had to strain to hear, she said, "I'll tell you where I live, if you help me with bad guy." Daniel's eyebrows shot up. This was an unexpected turn. "The bad guy," he repeated. "Who's the bad guy?" But the girl had already retreated back into silence, her eyes downcast. Daniel realized he was at a crossroads. He couldn't leave her here, but he also couldn't force her to come with him without potentially causing more trauma. As he pondered his next move, the sounds of the awakening park filtered into the phone booth. Birds chirped in nearby trees, and the distant laughter of children could be heard from a playground. The day was moving on, and Daniel knew he needed to make a decision. With a gentle smile, he extended his hand once more. "How about this?" he said. "You come with me and we'll work together to catch this bad guy. But first, we need to make sure you're safe. Sound good? Just give me a nod if you understand." The girl looked at his outstretched hand, then back at his face. For a long moment she was silent, and Daniel held his breath. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. As she stepped out of the phone booth, blinking in the bright morning sunlight, Daniel felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He had found the girl, yes, but he sensed that his day was about to become far more complicated than he had ever anticipated. As they stepped away from the phone booth, the bustling sounds of the park enveloped them. The girl kept a careful distance from Daniel, her small hands clutching the fabric of her blue dress. Daniel noticed how she flinched at every sudden noise: a dog's bark, a child's shout from the distant playground, the honk of a car horn from beyond the park's boundaries. "My name is PC Daniel Harris," he said gently, trying to establish some rapport. "Can you tell me your name now?" The girl looked up at him, her dark eyes wide and wary. She shook her head, lips pressed tightly together. Daniel sighed softly. "All right, that's okay. You don't have to tell me if you're not comfortable, but I do need to know where you live so we can get you home safely." At the mention of home, the girl's shoulders tensed visibly. "Pimlico," she whispered, so quietly Daniel almost missed it. He nodded, surprised. Pimlico was a quiet residential area just south of the park, about 10 minutes away by car. It was known for its mix of elegant townhouses and more affordable flats and housing estates. Not the area he'd expected, given the girl's apparent fear and reluctance to go home. "That's not far," Daniel said, keeping his tone light. "I'll walk you to my cruiser, parked not far from here near the Pall Mall, and I'll drive you home." The girl's eyes darted around as if looking for escape routes, but the officer noticed it. "I hope you don't plan to escape." The girl nodded finally. As they set off along the park path towards Pall Mall, Daniel tried to engage her in conversation, hoping to gain her trust. "Do you go to school around here?" he asked. No response. "What's your favorite subject?" Silence. "Do you like the park? I bet it's nice to live so close to it." The girl's only reply was to wrap her arms tighter around herself. Daniel's mind raced as they walked. Who was this child? What had happened to make her so guarded? And who was the bad guy she had mentioned? He knew he needed to proceed carefully. Pushing too hard could cause the girl to shut down completely. As they neared the park exit, the girl suddenly spoke. "Are you going to put me in jail?" Daniel was taken aback by the question. "No, of course not," he said quickly. "Why would you think that?" The girl shrugged, her eyes fixed on the ground. "That's what happens to bad people." "And you think you're a bad person?" Daniel asked gently. She didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. They crossed the street, leaving the relative tranquility of the park behind. The bustling streets of Pall Mall surrounded them, with people hurrying to work and school children chattering as they walked in groups. Daniel noticed how the girl seemed to shrink into herself, trying to become invisible among the crowd. As they walked, Daniel became aware of the curious glances thrown their way. A uniformed police officer escorting a young black girl was bound to attract attention. He heard snippets of conversation as they passed. "Good job, officer, catching one of those troublemakers early," muttered an elderly man. "Poor thing. Wonder where her parents are," whispered a woman to her companion. "Just what we need, more of them on our streets," grumbled a businessman into his mobile phone. Daniel felt a surge of protectiveness. He placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder, steering her away from the judgmental stares and whispers. To his surprise, she didn't flinch away from his touch this time. "Don't listen to them," he said softly. "They don't know you or your story." They walked in silence for a few more minutes before the girl spoke again. "Do you think I'm bad too?" Daniel stopped walking and crouched down to her level, meeting her eyes. "No, I don't," he said firmly. "I think you're a brave girl who's been through something scary, and I want to help you if you'll let me." When they reached the police car, Daniel initially moved to open the front passenger door for her. He didn't want to treat her like a criminal, and he hoped sitting in the front might help him gain her trust. But to his surprise, Amelia refused to enter. "My kind is not allowed to drive in front seats," she said quietly, her eyes downcast. Confused, Daniel asked, "What do you mean?" Amelia's voice was barely audible as she replied, "He said our kind only drives in back seats. Front seats are for the special people." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "Who told you that?" he asked, but Amelia had already retreated into silence. As they drove towards Pimlico, Daniel tried once more to get information from her. "Who's the bad guy you mentioned earlier?" he asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Is he the one who told you about the seats?" Amelia remained silent, staring out the window at the passing streets of London. "Can you tell me who you were calling in the phone booth?" Daniel tried again, but was met with the same silence he had come to expect. The short drive to Pimlico was filled with an uneasy quiet, broken only by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Daniel's mind raced with questions, each one adding to his growing concern about what exactly was happening in Amelia's home. "That's my house," she said, pointing to a modest townhouse across the street as they finally arrived in Pimlico. Daniel straightened up, following her gaze. The house looked well maintained, with flower boxes in the windows and a freshly painted front door. Nothing about its exterior hinted at any darkness within. "All right," Daniel said, trying to keep his tone light despite the unease growing in his stomach. "Shall we go and see if your parents are home?" The girl nodded reluctantly, and they crossed the street together. As they approached the front door, Daniel noticed the girl's breathing becoming more rapid, her small body tensing with each step. He knocked on the door, his other hand resting lightly on his belt, ready for any potential trouble. After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the door swung open. A white man with a kind face and neatly combed hair stood in the doorway. His eyes widened in surprise at the sight of the police officer, then darted to the girl. "Oh, thank goodness," the man said, his voice filled with what sounded like genuine relief. "We've been so worried. Thank you, officer." He turned to the girl, his tone shifting slightly. "Amelia, you're not being very good today. No movie for the whole week for leaving home unnoticed." He reached out to take Amelia's arm, clearly intending to usher her inside and close the door, but Daniel held up a hand, stopping him. "I have a few questions first, if you don't mind, Mr.?" he asked politely but firmly. The man nodded, a flicker of something, annoyance, worry, crossing his face before it settled back into a pleasant expression. "Of course, officer. I'm Gareth Wilkins, Amelia's father. What would you like to know?" Daniel stood on the doorstep, his police instincts on high alert as he observed Gareth Wilkins. The man's demeanor was pleasant enough, but there was something in his eyes that didn't quite match his concerned father act. He began to explain the morning's events. "Mr. Wilkins," Daniel began, "I found Amelia near St. James's Park. She had been running through Pall Mall and ended up hiding in a phone booth. When I approached her, she was extremely reluctant to speak with me or provide any information." Gareth's brow furrowed in what appeared to be concern. "Oh, Amelia," he sighed, looking down at the girl who was now standing slightly behind Daniel. "What have we told you about talking to strangers? Even if they're police officers, you should have called us immediately." Daniel noticed how Amelia seemed to shrink even further at her father's words. He pressed on. "Mr. Wilkins, Amelia mentioned something about a bad guy she was trying to get away from. Do you have any idea what she might have meant by that?" A flash of something crossed Gareth's face so quickly, Daniel almost missed it. Then the concerned father mask was back in place. "A bad guy? Oh, that must be from those crime shows she sometimes watches when we're not paying attention. I've told her they're not for children, but you know how kids are." Daniel nodded slowly, not entirely convinced. He crouched down to Amelia's level again. "Amelia, is that true? Was the bad guy just from a TV show?" Amelia's eyes darted between Daniel and her father. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, remaining silent. "She's been having a bit of a difficult time lately," Gareth interjected smoothly. "There was an incident at school last week, a fight with another student. We've had to be a bit stricter with her as a result. Perhaps that's why she ran off." Daniel straightened up, his mind working quickly. "I see, and which school does Amelia attend?" "St. Saviour's Primary," Gareth replied promptly. "It's just a few blocks from here." Daniel made a mental note to check with the school later. "Mr. Wilkins, is Amelia's mother at home? I'd like to speak with her as well." A shadow passed over Gareth's face. "I'm afraid Linda's not here at the moment. She's at the farmer's market. She goes every Tuesday morning." Something about the way Gareth said this didn't sit right with Daniel, but he couldn't put his finger on why. He looked down at Amelia, who was staring fixedly at the ground, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Amelia," Daniel said gently, "is there anything else you want to tell me before I go?" For a moment it seemed like Amelia might speak. She looked up at Daniel, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something that might have been hope. But then Gareth placed a hand on her shoulder, and she flinched, the moment passing. "I think that's quite enough questions, officer," Gareth said, his tone still pleasant, but with an underlying firmness. We appreciate your bringing Amelia home safely, but it's been a trying morning for all of us. If there's nothing else, we'd like to get inside and sort this out as a family." Daniel hesitated. Every instinct he had was screaming that something was wrong here, but he had no concrete evidence of any wrongdoing. Legally, he had no grounds to push further without a warrant or more substantial cause. "Of course, Mr. Wilkins," he said finally. "Thank you for your time. Amelia, you take care now, all right?" Amelia kept her gaze lowered, offering no response, and as Gareth began to close the door, Daniel added, "Oh, and Mr. Wilkins, I'll be following up with St. Saviour's about that incident you mentioned. Just standard procedure, you understand." A flicker of something, alarm, passed over Gareth's face, but it was gone in an instant. "Of course, officer. Whatever you need to do. Good day." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Daniel standing on the doorstep, his mind whirling with unanswered questions and a growing sense of unease. Daniel walked slowly back to his patrol car, parked along Pall Mall, his mind churning. The encounter with Gareth Wilkins had left him with more questions than answers, and a persistent sense that he was overlooking something crucial. The walk back took him 15 minutes. As he slid into the driver's seat, Daniel decided to catch up on any reports he might have missed during the chase. He pulled out his work phone and began scrolling through the dispatch logs from the last few hours. Suddenly, his eye caught on a report from earlier, right around the time he had been searching for Amelia in the park. Curious, he radioed the station. "This is P.C. Harris. Can you give me more information on the report filed at 11:23 this morning?" The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. "That was a 999 call, P.C. Harris." Came from a phone booth. Operator reported a child's voice, female, very quiet and hard to understand. Only caught a few words, "Help, Mom," and "scared." Daniel's heart rate quickened. It had to have been Amelia. "I think I know who made that call," he told the dispatcher. "I need to confirm one more thing. Can you do me a favor? I need a background check on Gareth Wilkins residing in Pimlico, and see what you can find on his family, especially his wife, Linda, and daughter, Amelia." While he waited for the information, Daniel drove to a nearby drive-through cafe. He needed coffee and a moment to gather his thoughts. The morning's events played over in his mind as he sipped the hot, bitter liquid. Amelia's fear, her reluctance to speak, the mention of a bad guy, none of it added up to a simple case of a child running away from home after being disciplined. His phone buzzed and he quickly answered. The dispatcher's voice came through, crisp and professional. "P.C. Harris, we've got that information for you. Gareth Wilkins, age 42, works as an accountant. No criminal record. He's been married to Linda Mensah Wilkins for 2 years. Linda, age 35, is originally from Ghana. She works part-time as a nurse. Amelia Mensah is Linda's daughter from a previous relationship. She's 8 years old and attends St. Saviour's Primary School." Daniel frowned. "Any records of domestic disturbances or complaints from neighbors?" "Nothing on file, sir," the dispatcher replied. "All right, thank you," Daniel said. "One more thing, can you contact St. Saviour's Primary? I need to know if there have been any recent incidents involving Amelia Mensah, particularly any fights or behavioral issues." "Will do, sir. I'll get back to you as soon as I have that information." Daniel ended the call and sat back, his mind working overtime. The background check hadn't revealed anything obviously suspicious, but it had confirmed one thing. Gareth wasn't Amelia's biological father. Could that be a source of tension in the household? He was about to start the car when his phone buzzed again. "P.C. Harris," he answered. "Sir, I've spoken with the administration at St. Saviour's Primary," the dispatcher said. "They have no record of any recent incidents involving Amelia Mensah. In fact, they described her as a quiet, well-behaved student who rarely causes any trouble." Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Gareth had lied to him, blatantly lied to a police officer. That, combined with Amelia's behavior and the mention of a bad guy, set alarm bells ringing in Daniel's head. He started the car, his decision made. He couldn't just leave this alone. He needed to check on Amelia one more time to make sure she was truly safe. As he drove back towards the Wilkins residence, Daniel's mind raced with possibilities. What was really going on in that house? And more importantly, What danger might Amelia be in right now? He parked a short distance from the house, keeping it in view. Everything seemed calm and in order. Still, he kept his eyes fixed on the building. Then, after a moment, movement caught his attention. A set of curtains on an upper-floor window was suddenly yanked shut, and for an instant it looked as though someone had been pressed against the glass. A chill ran down his spine. Daniel reached for his radio. "This is PC Harris. I need immediate backup at my location. Possible child in danger. No sirens." As he waited for backup to arrive, Daniel kept his eyes fixed on the house, his heart pounding. He silently urged Amelia to hold on just a little longer. Help was on the way, and this time he wouldn't leave until he was certain of her safety. The minutes crawled by as Daniel waited for backup to arrive. The quiet Pimlico street seemed to hold its breath, the usual sounds of suburban life muted and distant. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees lining the road, their shadows dancing on the pavement in an almost hypnotic pattern. Daniel's eyes remained fixed on the Wilkins residence, watching for any sign of movement or disturbance again. But the house had returned to its silent and still, its neat exterior betraying nothing of the tension Daniel sensed within. The curtains that had been so abruptly closed remained that way, like closed eyelids hiding secrets. He checked his watch for what felt like the 100th time. Only 7 minutes had passed since he'd called for backup, but it felt like an eternity. Every instinct told him to rush in, to make sure Amelia was safe, but years of training and experience held him back. Going in alone, without cause or warrant, could jeopardize any potential case and, more importantly, could put Amelia at even greater risk if his suspicions were correct. Finally, he saw 2 police cars turn onto the street, moving slowly and without sirens as he'd requested. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. As the car pulled up behind him, he saw 4 officers step out, 2 men and 2 women, all in plain clothes. Detective Sergeant Sarah Collins, a veteran officer with whom Daniel had worked before, approached his car. Her face was serious as she leaned down to speak through his open window. "What's the situation, Daniel?" she asked, her voice low and calm. Daniel quickly briefed her and the other officers on the morning's events, finding Amelia in the park, her reluctance to speak, the strange interaction with Gareth Wilkins, and the lie about the school incident. "Something's not right in that house, Sarah," he said firmly. "I saw someone pushed against the window. That little girl was terrified of something or someone, and I don't think we can afford to wait to find out what it is." Sarah nodded, her expression grim. Together they approached the Wilkins residence, Daniel's heart pounding with each step. The quiet Pimlico street seemed to hold its breath as they reached the front porch. Detective Sergeant Sarah Collins, a veteran officer, knocked firmly on the door. Seconds ticked by with no response. Sarah knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. The officers exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Sarah nodded, and 2 officers moved into position, ready to force the door open if necessary. Just as they were about to break in, the door suddenly swung open. To everyone's surprise, Amelia stood there, her small frame silhouetted in the doorway. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was a determination in her stance that hadn't been there earlier. Before anyone could speak, Amelia pressed her finger to her lips in a gesture for silence. The officers froze, watching as the little girl pointed up the stairs. "Bathroom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. No sooner had the word left her lips than they heard it. Loud thumps and angry voices coming from upstairs. The sounds of a struggle, muffled but unmistakable. Daniel's police instincts kicked in immediately. He glanced at Sarah, who gave a quick nod. "Go," she mouthed silently. Without hesitation, Daniel rushed into the house and up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. Behind him, he heard Sarah quietly instructing one of the female officers to stay with Amelia outside. The upper hallway was dim, the sounds of conflict growing louder as Daniel approached. He could make out 2 voices now. A man's, angry and threatening, and a woman's, pleading and fearful. Following the sounds, Daniel found himself outside the bathroom door. It was slightly ajar, and through the gap he could see flashes of movement. He heard the man, Gareth he assumed, shouting racist slurs and threats. "Your kind doesn't deserve more than to be a housemaid," Gareth yelled. "You should be grateful I even let you stay here." Daniel's blood ran cold as he realized the full extent of what was happening. He pushed the door open, his voice ringing out with authority. "Police, don't move!" The scene that greeted him made his stomach churn. A woman, Linda, Amelia's mother, was on her knees, scrubbing the floor. Gareth loomed over her, a belt clutched in his hand. Both of them froze at Daniel's entrance, their heads snapping towards him in shock. Gareth's face contorted with rage. "You!" he spat, recognizing Daniel from earlier. "You've got no right to be here." "Drop the belt and step away from her," Daniel commanded, his voice steady despite the anger boiling inside him. For a moment, it seemed Gareth might comply. Then, with a roar of fury, he lunged towards Daniel with the belt in hand. The next few seconds were a blur of motion. Daniel's training kicked in as he grappled with Gareth, trying to subdue him without causing unnecessary harm. He could hear footsteps pounding up the stairs, the other officers coming to assist. As they struggled, Gareth continued to shout, his words a mix of threats and racist vitriol. "It was a big mistake to take their side," he snarled. "That woman," he jerked his head towards Linda, "she's an immigrant from Ghana. They come here to our country, thinking they deserve all the comforts we have. She wasn't even born here. She should go back where she came from." With the help of the other officers, Daniel finally managed to restrain Gareth, securing handcuffs behind his back. As Gareth was led away, still shouting, Daniel turned his attention to Linda. She was still on the floor, shaking and clearly in shock. Daniel crouched down beside her, his voice gentle. "Mrs. Mensah, Linda, are you all right? We're here to help you." Linda looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and relief. "Amelia," she whispered, "where's my daughter?" "She's safe," Daniel assured her. "She's outside with one of our officers. She's the one who let us in, you know. She's a very brave girl." A small smile flickered across Linda's face, despite her obvious pain. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, she is." As the sounds of activity increased around them, officers securing the scene, calling for medical assistance, Daniel helped Linda to her feet. He knew this was just the beginning. There would be statements to take, an investigation to conduct, and most importantly, a little girl and her mother to protect. But for now, as he led Linda downstairs to be reunited with Amelia, Daniel felt a sense of relief wash over him. The morning had been long and fraught with tension, but finally, Amelia and her mother were safe, and that, he realized, made all the difference. As Daniel led Linda down the stairs, the house was a flurry of activity. Police officers were securing the scene, and the sound of approaching sirens indicated that paramedics were on their way. When they reached the front door, Amelia broke away from the officer watching her and ran to her mother. "Mama!" she cried, throwing her arms around Linda's waist. Linda knelt down, wincing slightly, and embraced her daughter tightly. "Oh, my brave girl," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Daniel watched the reunion with a mix of relief and concern. Both mother and daughter bore visible signs of abuse, bruises on their arms and what looked like belt marks on their backs where their clothes had shifted. The paramedics arrived moments later, and Daniel gently guided Linda and Amelia towards them. "Let's have them take a look at you both," he said softly, "just to make sure you're okay." As the paramedics began their examination, Detective Sergeant Sarah Collins approached Daniel. "We need to take their statements," she said, her voice low, "but let's give them a moment first." Daniel nodded, his eyes never leaving the small family. After a few minutes, when the initial medical checks were complete, he and Sarah approached Linda and Amelia. "Mrs. Mensah," Sarah began gently, "I know this is difficult, but we need to ask you some questions about what happened. Would that be all right?" Linda nodded, her arm still wrapped protectively around Amelia. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now. "Yes, I think it's time the truth came out." Over the next hour, as the paramedics continued to tend to their injuries, Linda shared her story. Her voice trembled at times, but she pressed on, seeming to grow stronger with each word. "I'm an immigrant from Ghana," she began. "Amelia and I moved to London 2 years ago. I had a stable job as a nurse, but we were missing a sense of community. When I met Gareth, I thought we'd finally found a happy new family. She paused, taking a deep breath. But after a few months of marriage, everything changed. He started cheating on me with other women. When I confronted him, he blamed me, saying I was no longer attractive to him, and that Amelia was upsetting him. Then he became racist and abusive. Linda's eyes filled with tears as she recounted the events of that day. This morning, when Gareth was hurting me, I managed to signal to Amelia to escape. I told her to find a phone and call 999. I was so scared. But I knew it was our only chance. Daniel and the sergeant detective took in their story, the detective jotting everything down in her notepad. When Gareth realized Amelia was gone and had been brought back by a police officer, he was furious. He beat us both with his belt, Linda added. Daniel felt a surge of anger at the brutality this family had endured. You don't need to be scared anymore, he assured Linda, his voice firm but gentle. With all this evidence, that monster will be locked away for a long time. Noticing Amelia was still silent, Daniel leaned toward her gently, curiosity getting the better of him, and he couldn't help himself but asked, Amelia, what you did was very brave, but I need to understand something. Can you tell me why you were so scared of me? I know it's because of what Gareth did, but earlier, you seemed terrified of me too. I'm a police officer. You could have told me about your stepfather, and I would have helped you. Amelia, who had been silent until now, spoke up. I ran away to the phone booth in the park, she said quietly. I tried to be as fast as I could. She hesitated then, her gaze dropping as if she were wrestling with something inside, the rest of her words caught in her throat. Linda stepped in, her hand gently stroking her daughter's hair. Amelia is very scared of questions, especially from men in authority, she explained. Back in Ghana, our community often used threats of police to scare children into obedience. Linda's voice grew heavy as she continued. Amelia's biological father, he stole a chicken once. The police caught him and beat him severely with their batons. They didn't even take him to the station. He died the next day from internal bleeding. Since then, Amelia has been terrified of authority figures. Daniel and Sarah exchanged shocked glances, the weight of this family's past trauma settling heavily upon them. Linda managed a small smile. Being here for 2 years has helped a little. Amelia can talk to doctors and teachers now, and even on the phone, as long as they don't ask too many questions. When she observes people long enough, she sometimes opens up on her own. That's why she felt brave enough to call 999. It was just over the phone. As Daniel and Sarah absorbed this information, Amelia suddenly spoke up again. Thank you for saving us, she said softly, her eyes meeting Daniel's for the first time without fear. Daniel knelt down to her level. That's my job, he said warmly. And Amelia, I want you to know something. Everything that man told you about black people not having the same rights, that's not true. You are beautiful as you are, and you're a very special, brave girl. Your courage saved your mother today. Amelia's brow furrowed. But those people on the street, they all thought bad things about me. Daniel thought for a moment, then said, You know, we can't stop birds from flying over our heads and sometimes, well, doing their business on us. But we can definitely stop them from building nests on our hands. He smiled gently at her confused expression. What I mean is, people often judge before knowing the full story. We can't stop them from speaking, but we can choose to ignore what they say and not let their words take root in our minds and hearts. A small smile appeared on Amelia's face as understanding dawned in her eyes. The lead paramedic approached them, clipboard in hand. The injuries aren't serious, he reported. We've applied balm and medication to help with the healing. They should avoid hot water and strenuous exercise for a while, and if anything worsens, they should visit the hospital. Also, he added, his voice softening, I'd recommend they see a child psychologist to help Amelia process this trauma. Daniel nodded his thanks, then turned back to Linda and Amelia. Would you like to come with me to the station? He asked, then quickly caught himself. Sorry, I shouldn't ask like that. Let me try again. He smiled reassuringly. Let's go together to the station. We'll sort everything out and make sure Gareth won't be able to hurt you both again. Amelia's face lit up with a genuine smile and she nodded. As they walked towards the police car, the setting sun painted the London sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink. Daniel opened the back door, helping Linda and Amelia settle in comfortably. As he slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, he caught sight of them in the rearview mirror, mother and daughter, holding each other close, their faces reflecting a mix of exhaustion and hope. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the house that had been both a refuge and a prison. As they drove towards the station, Daniel felt a profound sense of purpose wash over him. Today, he hadn't just enforced the law. He'd helped change lives, restore faith, and offer a chance at a new beginning. The road ahead would not be easy for Linda and Amelia, but they had taken the first brave steps towards a better future. And Daniel silently vowed to do everything in his power to ensure they received the support and justice they deserved. As the familiar silhouette of the police station came into view, Daniel realized that this was why he had become a police officer in the first place, not just to uphold the law, but to protect the vulnerable, to serve his community and to make a difference one person at a time.